All right, so good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Resilience Hub. My name is David Howden, and I'm the founder and CEO of Howden Insurance Brokers. And I have an unusual attribute, which is that I'm seriously passionate about insurance. Yeah. And actually, as well as being passionate about insurance, I'm also a big believer that it's a central part of building resilience. And I think if there's one thing I picked up from the theme of COP27, it's about implementation. Let's stop talking and let's do things. And that's easy to say. Of course, implementation requires action. And I think if there's another theme coming out, it's that, we're all talking about trying to stop future climate change. But the reality is, it's already here, it's now, and it's affecting communities. And the sad reality of that is many of the communities affecting are the ones that didn't cause the problems in the first place, which is why, of course, there's a lot of talk around loss and damage. When I was at COP26 in Glasgow, we focused on one particular area. And we talked about, in essence, disaster relief. And I don't know if you know the figures, but I mentioned that at the beginning of the century, there was a gap of about $1 billion between what was available for disaster relief and what was needed. That had grown actually to $4 billion 10 years later. By the time I was talking at COP, it was $20 billion. $20 billion gap. Today, how much have we reduced that by? Well, of course we haven't. It's actually grown to $30 billion. And what's causing that growth in that gap? First and foremost, it's what we're talking about already. It's climate change. We all know that. The disasters are happening. Look now today, some of the worst floods in decades in Pakistan, some of the worst drought ever, in decades in the Horn of Africa. So we know that the problems are growing. On top of that, there's another problem happening, which is that actually we're facing uncertain geopolitical and financial times at the moment. And that, of course, is affecting the cost of disaster relief just as much as affecting our own cost of livings that we worry about. Can we heat our houses? Whereas a lot of humanitarian organizations are, can I actually rebuild countries, rebuild livelihoods? And then something else is happening, which is the funding that's available is shrinking. Pre-2018, funding for this was growing by 2.6%. It's by 10%. It's now growing by 2.6%. And why is that? Well, I think we know that. The pressure on governments is enormous. Where's their funding going to? Even before we had the current issues, there was pressure on governments and their budgets. Now you're seeing that even more. You're seeing some governments talk about aid, foreign aid, being what they expend in their own country. So I think it's clear to me that we have a problem, and we have one we need to solve here and now. Okay, next question, obvious question. What the hell has this got to do with me, an insurance broker, CEO of an insurance broker? Why am I talking about humanitarian aid budgets? Well, I think very simple. I talked about the disasters going on in the global south, but of course, it's actually happening all around the world. You know that in Europe last year, we had the huge, great big floods in Germany. In Australia, they've got both bushfires and they've got floods. In Texas, we've got freezes. We've had the biggest hurricane we've experienced in years. You name it. There are natural disasters going on all around the world. But what's the one fundamental difference, primarily, between those disasters in the global north versus the global south? It's insurance. Insurance is generally there to pick up the pieces, to build resilience. We're in the Resilience Hub. It is there to build back the communities, whether it's individual communities, whether it's municipalities. Insurance is there to build resilience. Do you know what percentage of the global south can rely on or access insurance for these problems? 7%. 7%. So 93% has no resilience built in whatsoever from insurance. So that's why, as a lowly insurance broker, I'm talking about humanitarian aid budgets. Okay. So Why do so few people in developing nations buy insurance? I want to explore that a bit, and it might be easy to say a quick answer, but I think there are three key reasons. The first is understanding the value, or rather not understanding the value. The second is affordability. And the third, which actually is prevalent in our industry generally, in my view, is trust. So let's look at those individually. First of all, understanding the value. Most of you in this room probably have insurance, and you sort of know how it works, don't you? You pay an annual small amount, you may think it's too much, annual premium, and hopefully when a disaster happens, the insurance company pays your loss. Relatively simple, that's how it works. That's not really very effective in many, many parts of the world. And it's certainly not effective for disaster relief, where you can't wait for an adjuster to tell you 8 months whether your loss is valid or not. So what's really growing up in this area is parametric insurance. And why is parametric insurance so relevant? It is relevant because, in essence, it has two key things. It is guaranteed and it is immediate. And that is absolutely critical because it reacts on triggers. Too much wind, too much heat, too much storm damage, whatever that means, that trigger creates a guaranteed payment, and it guarantees that payment whatever, even if there are other disasters going on elsewhere. Your money is guaranteed and it's paid immediately. So what does that mean in terms of disaster relief? Well, to me, what it means is the ability to stop a disaster becoming a crisis. The same as we use insurance very often in the global north. This all sounds great, doesn't it? Fantastic. The only trouble is who's going to pay for it? Where's the money coming from? It's certainly not likely to come from a humanitarian organization. They've already got hugely stretched budgets already. We've talked about governments, Have the governments got more money for this? Very, very difficult to go to governments. And there's even a bit of a suspicion of why should we use government money to buy insurance? Are the insurance people trustworthy, etc.? So where's it going to come from? Well, maybe it's actually right under our nose where that money's going to come from. I think if I look at the private sector, I'm at Glasgow at COP26, we launched for the first time a volcano bond for the Red Cross to cover basically the devastation following a volcano. We used company money, our foundation, to fund that premium. We put the program in place after having listened carefully to what the Red Cross needed and put that in place. And actually, from that small start, we've now worked with many other companies within the insurance industry to talk to them about how they might use their foundations to allow the people who generally can't access insurance to access the benefit of insurance. And that's happening here and now. So that's affordability. Next one is trust. To me, I always say that our industry is not always very good at listening. And what we need to do to build trust is we need to listen. We need to listen to the humanitarian organizations and work out what it is they need. We need to understand what protections they've already put in place. What are the triggers they need? When would they need the money? How would they need the money? We need to demystify insurance. Insurance can be tied up in a lot of jargon and small print. We need to make it very accessible to them so they feel empowered by these products. Absolutely critical. And finally, to build trust, you need proof. Talk is easy, I've said it already, action is loud. You need to prove that you've done this, and you need to prove that you've done this time and time again. So, that's trust. Build the trust. Proof points. I want to talk about proof points. I told already at COP26, we talked about the volcano bond, and I actually said I felt it was like an acorn. And I hoped that acorn we were doing was going to grow into a huge, great big forest of great big oaks. Well, let me tell you, the saplings are there. They're there. Just even since COP26, in that 1 year, we've now got 7 to 8 projects covering Asia, Africa, Middle East, Pacific, all projects where we're working with humanitarian organizations to cover things like storm damage, excess wind, floods, etc. And we're protecting either farming or coastal communities. So there's a real, actual proof going on that the original concept was one that could be taken and could be expanded. But 7 or 8 projects isn't very much. We need to scale. How do we scale? Well, actually, what we're doing is we're planning to double the amount of projects we're doing. But critically, I'm back to what I said before, we're now working with others in the insurance industry, and we think with the next 3 to 5 years, we can get enough projects going to get $2 billion of insurance protection to plug that gap. That would be scaling and be really, really relevant. So it's a good start. It's a good start, but it's still not enough. I sit on the Sustainable Markets Initiative, the SMI. I don't know what you know, if you know what the SMI is, but basically it was launched by His Majesty King Charles III in his former role when he was the Prince of Wales. And it was launched in Davos 2020, and it was to bring together the private sector. And it was bring together the private sector to help lead a way to transition to a more sustainable future. Critically, and this is the important part, by putting nature, people, and planet at the heart of value creation. And I think that's an important part. If we're going to galvanize the private sector, it's got to be put for the right causes, but putting it at value creation as well. So the SMI is all about collaboration. It's how we work together. There's an insurance task force, there's an energy task force, an aviation task force. There's lots of task forces working together, but 150 CEOs. And it's by working together we're coming up with solutions. Imagine now if all of those 150 companies just use a small part of the money their foundations have to help build resilience, to help with disaster relief. How big would that scale? Indeed, others of you sitting here today in your organizations, what would happen if we were to pull together? Suddenly, the 2 billion would actually grow very, very fast indeed. And I think that critically to me, it's about scale, but it's also very much about speed. We had a group conference a few weeks ago, and we had a wonderful lady, Dr. Catherine Green, come to talk at a conference. And she led the Oxford University research into the AstraZeneca vaccination for COVID. And their challenge was that COVID wasn't going to go away, fast. And normally from developing a potential vaccine, which you think is going to work, to getting to market, it's 8 years. It takes 8 years to do that because of all the valley of death of the money, raising the money, it's an 8-year delay. They had to work out how they could take an 8-year delay down to 1 year. And they did that, 8 years to 1 year. When you ask how, it was all about collaboration, putting the egos aside, and just thinking we can do the impossible. And it made me really think that if we collaborate and move fast, we can do that. COVID wasn't going away without vaccinations. Climate change is not going away without us doing something. We all know that. Everyone who's here, I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but the reality is it is about action. It's how we shrink things that might have taken a decade to take a year. So we need to scale, but we also need to move very, very fast indeed. Before I introduce the panel and ask Lauren to come up here, I just want to leave you with something that was said last year at COP that resonated with me very greatly at the time. And it was David Attenborough. And I think it's a great phrase. Many of you, I'm sure, heard it before, but it's great. It's that if working apart, we are forced powerful enough to destabilize our planet, surely working together, we are powerful enough to save it. Let's work together and do that, shall we? Lauren, would you like to come up, please? Ekosway.
Yes. Okay.
I will let you do the introductions.
Thank you, David, and thank you, everyone, for sharing your afternoon with us.
Yeah. Good.
This is a room that's passionate about building resilience and the role that the insurance market can play. And so it's my pleasure to moderate the next part of this session, which is going to be a panel. But as I do, I want to just share something that we are going to be launching together with Howden and with the Sustainable Markets Initiative. And that is something called the Global Risk and Resilience Fellowship. And this Global Risk and Resilience Fellowship comes as all the initiatives that Resilient Cities Network, the organization that I run, comes to as a demand-driven initiative. And it really comes out of a tale of two cities who are very different, who are both members of the Resilient Cities Network. The first is the city of Christchurch. And if those of you who are familiar with the city of Christchurch know that they suffered a terrible earthquake, the Canterbury quakes. And after that, they really invested in building their resilience because of the market in New Zealand and because of their lived experience. They're very, very serious about insurance. And every single year, the Chief Resilience Officer of Christchurch and the head of the infrastructure portfolio of Christchurch will fly to London to make sure that their entire portfolio is insured, so that no matter what risk they face, no matter what disaster can come, it does not become a crisis. Now, the other city is a city that we work with very closely in Indonesia, and that is Semarang. Semarang suffers from increasing flood risk related to climate change. And during the first phase of Resilient Cities, when it was called 100 Resilient Cities, for those of you who remember that stage, we worked very closely with the insurance industry. And we didn't fly Semarang to London, but in fact, we flew insurance experts to Semarang. And with one of our reinsurance partners, we sat in the room to try to talk about the benefits that insurance could bring and a parametric product might bring to Semarang. But there was a big problem. The city had nowhere near the capacity and the trust to even think about investing in that kind of product. And so this enormous gap, which David really broke down into the affordability, the understanding, and the trust, is a huge gap. And so the Global Risk and Resilience Fellowship is an opportunity to actually place experienced insurance professionals on a demand-driven basis into cities for 6 months at a time. And we really hope that many of the other organizations in the SMI will join up and will also make expertise available so that we can really speed and scale this initiative. So I'm really thankful to Howden for initiating this with us. We're very excited about it. And now I want to turn to the panel. So today we're going to have 3 panelists with us, and I'm going to ask for them to introduce themselves in turn. First, live here in the studio with us, we have Ikose Iyahen, and she is the head of the Insurance Development Forum. So Ikose, let me give the floor to you first, and I'm going to pass you the microphone because we've been told this is the live microphone, so that you can introduce the work that you do.
Okay, thank you, Lauren, for the introduction. And it was great to also hear the remarks by Mr. Howden earlier about, the need to invest in resilience and the role of insurance. I'm the Secretary General of the Insurance Development Forum. It's a public-private partnership led by the insurance industry, co-chaired with the United Nations and World Bank Group and other international organizations. And our objective really is to expand the use of insurance, but I would say related risk management capabilities that exist within the industry to help to address the protection gap and build resilience if we are talking about people, businesses, communities, governments. So that's really our work, and I'm really hoping to share some insights into what implementation looks like and the complexities of that in the context of developing countries, and particularly in the space that we're in right now and the conversations that are happening around adaptation and loss and damage.
Thank you, Ikose. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our virtual panelists who are here in an emissions-free arrangement with us. So thank you for being here with us. The first person I'm going to introduce is Sheikh Maz Tanvir, who's the head of communication and natural resource management for Hans Pakistan. So if I can turn it over to you, Maz.
Hi, Lauren. Thank you so much for the introduction. Like she said, I'm Mas Tanveer. I'm from Pakistan. I work for an NGO called HANDS. We have been basically working in Pakistan since the last 43 years. We have responded to over 36 major disasters in the country, and we have been closely working with different organizations, local organizations and international organizations to respond to these disasters. As you are always obviously aware, the situation right now with regards to floods, so I want to shed a light towards the issues that we are facing in disaster risk financing and the steps we have taken to curb that. So hopefully in my session, I'll be delivering that. Thank you.
Thank you, Maz. And last but certainly not least, we have Robin Levy, who's here with us from the Jamaican Cooperative Credit Union League.
Greetings and salutations from the beautiful island of Jamaica. My name is Robin Levy, as you've heard, and I work with the Jamaica Cooperative Credit Union League, which is the umbrella organization for all the credit unions in Jamaica. We have over 1 million members across the island, but this is an island, and we as small island states in the Caribbean are, of course, very much subject to the vicissitudes of the weather. We have not just challenges with excessive rainfall or not enough rainfall, but we have hurricanes. We're actually still in hurricane season. I don't know if all of you there are aware that there's currently a storm headed, for example, to Florida. It's going to pass through Bahamas on the way. But the Caribbean is extremely susceptible to weather events of different kinds. And this, of course, makes lending to agricultural ventures far more risky than it probably is in larger land bodies. So I'm going to share with you a little bit of our experience with the parametric weather insurance, which just actually went into place this year with the help of Howden, Lloyd's of London, and others.
Thank you, Robin. Now, this is an insurance crowd, so I'm just going to take a quick poll. How many of you like to know what's going to happen before it happens and prepare? Okay, I'd say that's the majority. So I'm going to share with you the objectives for this session, right? What is it that officially we want to accomplish in the next, we have about 35 minutes. So our aims are threefold. First, we actually want to hear from our frontline practitioners what's happening, what's the story in terms of humanitarian issues, but also just day-to-day business and how insurance can play a role. The second, and David talked about affordability and filling this gap, is perhaps the role that private foundations and philanthropy can play and explore that theme a little bit in terms of bridging this gap. And the last is really to encourage more investment. We have a lot of different actors here in the market. And so to really talk about and really ideate about what is the art of the possible. So those are the three things we hope to accomplish and hope to inspire with the panel today. Now, I want to actually open it up first and foremost with some of that perspective from the front lines, from the humanitarian side. And so, Maz, can you share with us, I think it's front and center of everyone's minds, what's been happening in Pakistan and the devastating floods that have occurred. What are some of the issues that are being faced in real time as you try to access financing and respond to the floods?
Thank you, Lauren. Like I said, that these floods have been one of the worst climate disasters in history of mankind, if I can say. Over 33 million people are affected. That's like more than the population of many European countries if you put it into that context. The scale is unprecedented. Even in 2010 and following years, we faced similar floods, but they were not to the scale that we are facing right now. In the province of Sindh, we have a 100-kilometer wide lake right now. It's like a lake over the agricultural land. So that can put into context the level of devastation that we have faced. In financial context, over 30 billion losses of agriculture, that's in dollars, $30 billion, US dollars, losses of agriculture, land, life, and infrastructure. So if we talk about such devastation, then we must ask that how people are going to bounce back. So with regards to our own hands responding to the disaster, we faced a lot of issues while financing this recovery and rehabilitation phase. Initially, unfortunately, government was a bit slow to respond. because in Pakistan, the structure is such that the government has to first request the UN and international agencies to respond to any disaster, then they come in. So the request from the local government, from the federal government was a bit slow. It took a few weeks for them to request them. Then obviously, then the whole, you know how the humanitarian structure goes in. There are proposals, they accept proposals, and then the financing gets underway. So unfortunately, it was a bit slow, the recovery and response, and we lost a lot of, there were more damages that happened because of this. Further challenges, obviously, to access the funding included the government regulations. Unfortunately, in Pakistan, since the last 10, 15 years, we have faced stringent regulations to local NGOs and INGOs because of governments trying to, you know, curb the financing. And basically, in Pakistan's context, it was because of Financial Action Task Force that was set up by the IMF. So because of that, there were so many INGOs which were closed down and they left. So in this case, in 2022, when we were facing the floods, we didn't have enough agencies on ground or enough financing agencies that were able to fund these issues. Only a few donors had a very good streamlined financing mechanism in terms of disaster. Which is START Network, which we are working in, which is a UK-based network. And they have a trigger mechanism which helped us funding in this flood and before this in drought and other disasters as well. So obviously there's a huge gap which insurance companies and industry can plug in here in Pakistan. Unfortunately, like David said, that there might be a lack of trust, and there are also a lot of lack of knowledge about insurance industry in Pakistan. People are not that aware that how insurance industry can fill in these gaps of financing in disasters. So this is something which needs to be talked about, which needs policies to be made, and this is the perfect time, I think, the perfect session that can elaborate on it. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Maz. I think you highlighted a number of points that I just want to double click on as we progress in this dialogue. I mean, the first and foremost, the scale of what has happened and the fact that 100-year storm is no longer a 100-year storm, right? These are storms that we're seeing 5, 10 years, much more regularly at a scale that we need to be better prepared for. So anticipating and understanding that risk is really key. I think you also spoke really directly about the speed issue when you don't have insurance in place and when you have to go and look for disaster relief and financing through the international system, and the slow or perhaps the finances that never come as a result of some of those conversations. And then finally, the ecosystem to deliver that finance, right? That the capacity to have those mechanisms in place to deploy the capital and then get it to people so that you don't have compounding impacts of the initial disaster, right? Being able to respond fast enough that you avoid those additional risks to local communities and then populations. So looking at what is happening and some of the initiatives that are already ongoing, Igoswe, I wanted to open it up to you because the work that you do is very inspiring, and you've been really treading this path for some time. What are some of the initiatives that can build capacity upstream and actually deliver impact?
Okay, thank you, Lauren, for that. I have to acknowledge that there are many people in this room who are at the forefront of implementation and leading, I think, the industry's engagement on this topic. So yes, I take some of the praise, but it's many others out there. So I think that our colleague from Pakistan really touched on some very important and salient points in terms of the complexity of disasters when they occur, and the challenges that often occur when people try to then scramble resources together to effect response. In a context when we know that we can do better by preparing, we know that we can put resources in place to deal with these disasters. We know that we can make sure that we have contingency plans in place so that the impacts are reduced on poor and vulnerable people, but yet it doesn't happen. So I think that the work that we do within the IDF has actually been really built on learning from the experiences of implementation, learning on what the strengths but also what the limitations are in terms of what the industry can bring to the table versus what the public sector also needs to deliver. So the point that I made earlier in terms of the importance of the IDF as a public-private partnership is that if we want to effect really deep structural change, it has to be built on public-private partnerships. And it has to be built on a depth of conversation with countries in terms of how they think about risk, how they understand it, what kind of risk management mechanisms are available to them. Some might not be of their own choosing. There are limitations of access to. These are the kinds of conversations that we need to have. In terms of what the industry can do, I think the efforts that we have led through the IDF have been quite remarkable in galvanizing the public sector, particularly the United Nations and the World Bank around this topic. If I can reflect on my own experiences, 5 years, 10 years ago, when I was struggling to implement with my colleagues risk pools in the Caribbean, it was a struggle to have a conversation with the Ministry of Finance about the role of insurance, right? Today, that conversation is very different. I'm having a discussion with the Minister of Finance in Ghana. He's saying, Ekwaswehi, the protection gap is not a protection gap. It is a sinkhole for me, right? And so for me, what the industry has to offer is really a shift in thinking, not just insurance, but how can we deploy our thinking around ex-ante financing and the related risk management capabilities that come with it? How can we support countries in terms of deepening the availability of information that can allow them to make better decisions around their risk? What are the new solutions that we can design for these countries? The solutions that maybe worked in Germany or London or wherever are not necessarily all the time the solutions that are appropriate in developing countries. Are we willing to listen, to work with them, to work with the public sector, to design new systems, to co-develop new systems? So for me, to your question, I think that there's a lot happening within the insurance industry. Within the IDF, we placed specific emphasis on risk modeling, but also working with our public sector counterparts such as the UNDP and the World Bank to really have those sustained conversations around what is your risk and what do meaningful solutions look like. And I'll point to an example. We have a program currently in Peru where we were approached by the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Finance following the floods, 2018, I think, El Nino floods, where significant damage to infrastructure. And the concern there was how can we provide an insurance program to cover public schools, 50,000 public schools. What the industry can offer there is working with the government to create a database of what does that public infrastructure look like, right? That's important from an underwriting perspective, but it's also important for how do I manage my infrastructure? How do I invest in it to make sure that it is resilient? And that is important because the value is governments can use that beyond the insurance to make critical decisions. In terms of the insurance, the value, yes, is when you have a flood event, you get some resources, you implement response, but if you can implement it in time, the impacts are profound. Can you imagine if a school is destroyed, and we've all seen it with COVID, children are out of school, the frustration of parents, right? You're in a developing country, significant loss of infrastructure, you pull children out of school, the likelihood of those children going back into the system is low. And then you can take it a step further. If you are a girl, the likelihood of getting access to education is further reduced. So when I think about the role of the insurance industry, and I hope that my insurance industry colleagues can attest to this, and the ones that are certainly part of the IDF, it's not just insurance, right? It is a system of thinking about how do we use and build, how do we use the tools that we have? How do we push the frontier of those tools to help governments that are in distress to think about placing financing beforehand proactively so that they can reduce this impact? And our discussions here at COP are precisely about that, supporting governments through very complex questions and challenges.
Thank you, Iko. So, I mean, you covered so much ground there, and I think left us with this challenge of using the tools we have to reframe the discussion and actually change the way we look at risk and resilience financing as an ex-ante, right? How can we get there before? Robin, I want to come to you. You have a different role as a financial intermediary and as the leader of an organization which is making loans to small farmers in Jamaica. How is climate change impacting the work you do, and how do you see insurance playing a role there?
Well, thank you for that lead in. Actually, I was very interested to hear you know, the points raised just now about changing the discussion. Climate change here is very real. We are seeing far more storm activity every year. I think this is one of the busiest seasons we've had where we don't normally have storms that run into December, but it's predicted that this year, but not only the hurricane season start early, but it's also going to end later. So we're seeing far more activity. It's almost a guarantee every year that 1 or 2 islands are going to be hit and are going to be hit hard, and almost certainly their agricultural output is going to suffer. There's going to be infrastructure damage. There's going to be damage to other critical things. Now, where we sit as lenders, and you know, we do a significant amount of lending to MSMEs and to small farmers specifically. It's problematic to make these agricultural loans because of their very high risk levels. When you don't have too much rain, you have too little. Global warming is real. If you don't believe me, take a trip to the Caribbean. It's warmer now than it ever has been. And it's actually, interestingly, a little cooler sometimes in the off seasons away from summer than it usually is. But we are getting more severe weather events. We're getting more droughts. We're getting more floods. It's a lot of extremes and very little in the middle. As lenders, what this means is that you have to risk premium agricultural loans. You have to be very careful about what loans you make. You know, you need farmers who are much more experienced. The cost and risk of agricultural financing is just much higher than it is to buy a car, for instance. So this product we now have, it's easy to understand. It's easy to sell. It's easy for persons to make claims, and you get paid quickly. So what it does is it protects the lenders as much as it does the farmers. So it actually is going to, we think, revolutionize lending to the agricultural sector in Jamaica and hopefully the rest of the Caribbean. What we, the discussions about changing the discussion, we don't have a lot of support, government support here. We, of course, we're nonprofits as credit unions. We're cooperatives. We believe in, grassroots development and persons pulling themselves up. There's not a lot of money that government has. There's not a lot of room for public-private partnerships. But what we do have is a strong entrepreneurial class, a lot of persons who are interested in going into agriculture, but they're having difficulty getting financing. This product, we think, can be replicated because of its ease of use, ease of claim, all of these things, and actually should, in the medium term, bring down the cost of lending and allow much more persons to get loans and for their loans to be covered and protected from severe weather events. So we think this is something that can be replicated pretty much across the board, but definitely in small island states like ours.
Thank you, Robin. And I think that intention is so important, because what you're talking about is not just managing climate risk, but actually providing for opportunity and more equitable outcomes, right? Making finance available so that more people can develop their businesses, and taking the risk in lending down to a level that encourages people to come in and not to be afraid to lend. Maz, I want to come back to you. David spoke about the ability for insurance to provide funding when there are some preconditions, or we see an event coming on the horizon, as well as then after. Could you see a mechanism like that being useful, and how would that have helped Pakistan?
Yeah, so basically, there's a lot to do in the insurance industry in Pakistan. Like I said, so this gap hasn't been really explored yet, unfortunately. So the insurance sector estimates that less than 1% of the residential property in Pakistan is insured against natural hazards. So if you can imagine that less than 1% of the whole of this housing sector is insured, so that's a very less number, and 99% is still there. So there's a lot to do. if you talk about disaster preparedness and establishing early warning system, these are essential in developing resilience and adapting to the climate change. And I'll give you an example from recent floods as well. That it's a small town called Johi in Daudu, Sindh, which has been impacted by floods. The whole of Sindh province is impacted. It's a small town, like 300,000 people. It's an example of unity and innovativeness, and how this could have been ensured by disaster risk financing. This example, at the immediate news of the flood waters coming in, thousands of people in the city, they volunteered, including men, women, to develop a 7-kilometer long flood protection wall with sandbags around the town. So if you can imagine, local people building a 7-kilometer long wall with sandbags just to protect their own city, with their own resources, with their own will, with their own volunteer will, which they did. And the wall saved the whole town of Johi from the flood. Thousands of volunteers, they spent day and night maintaining the wall, ensuring there were no breaches at all. So this is one of the examples where a coordinated early warning trigger mechanism can be used to raise insurance financing for people to take up such innovative disaster mitigation techniques. Further, since most of the people are at risk for disasters, majority of them are local farmers which are at risk, and these farmers don't own the land which they work on. So where insurance mechanism can support them is through obviously they are paid out through the yearly yields that the crops that they get, and the farmers, the peasants that work on the land, they get a percentage of the share that the yield gets. So here insurance can support these people, that in case of a trigger, in case of a flood trigger, in case of a drought trigger, if the crops get destroyed, these people are insured against the percentage that they were supposed to get, and they'll get the livelihood that they're supposed to get for the rest of the year when they were supposed to sell their crops. So this is something that can be done. Insurance triggers can support these individuals to pay out the percentage that they were supposed to get. And this is the same case because the rural people have livestock, which is their only asset. So the insurance premium or insurance products can be designed to support them in case of loss of livestock as well. The same system can be applied in slow onset disasters like droughts. Obviously, weather models predict lack of rainfall can immediately release insurance funds to those communities going to be impacted and help them able to be sustained through the climate shocks. In HANDS, what we do is to tackle this issue, we have taken this up with our funding partners and established disaster risk management centers across the country. What these centers do is they have contingency stocks, they have contingency mechanisms available, which are financed through early warning systems, which are financed through early warning financing mechanism. And in case of a disaster, immediately these tools are deployed, these teams are deployed, which can curb the damages that could be done if these measures are not taken. Yeah.
Thank you, Mas. I want to ask Ikoshwe another question, but before I do, I also want to acknowledge that in this room we have a mix of private sector, insurance actors, and also representatives of organizations who do the kind of work that Mas and Robin are doing. So I want to give you, again, a little peek at the future, like 3 minutes to 5 minutes from now when Ikoshwe finishes her answer to the next question. And I am going to actually ask Mas and Robin, what are some of the things that they would like the insurance industry or private sector actors who are designing financial responses to resilience challenges to think about as they design those principles? But I also want to open up that response to the members of the audience. So if you are in the audience and you are on the front lines and working with communities that are dealing with this, please feel free to jot down some thoughts here, because this is an inclusive space. Okay, so we want to open it up not just to the panelists, but to those of you who have taken the time to show up and vote with your feet today to be with us in the Resilience Hub. So with that, I want to say, Ikoshwe, we know that data and analytics are key to managing risk. So what are some of the things that we could be doing? What are some of the tools we could be using better to prepare ourselves?
Thank you for that, Lauren. I want to react to a point made by Mas and Robin as it relates to, in developing countries, the entrepreneurial class, right, and communities. I think that oftentimes we focus our conversations on, humanitarian response intervention, but it's also about insurance to allow you to take risks and grow, right? It's insurance in the context of development, right? It's not just insurance in a reactionary sort of thing, right? And so that is a conversation, again, to the point that I was making earlier. What are the conversations that we're having with our governments about the role of insurance in development, right? How do they see the development of insurance markets in terms of helping them to absorb the kinds of shocks that they are seeing in unprecedented ways, right? So I just wanted to put that on the table in terms of how we think about insurance and its role in helping the tremendous entrepreneurial class that are taking huge risks without any protection whatsoever. So in terms of addressing the specific question in terms of the risk analytics, for us, as I mentioned earlier as the IEDF, it's foundational when you think about what the insurance industry can bring to the table. That understanding around risk, the transparency around that, the leveling of the conversation between partners so that you are speaking about one risk, we are talking about the same thing, right? And not something completely different. So for us, that's a critical part of what we do as an institution and how we see the value that the industry can bring to the public sector challenge and also private sector challenge in many of our countries. What does this look like? So last year at COP26, there were 3 programs that we committed to, that we launched at COP26, very much focused on this idea. The first was, how can we build a public-private partnership with vulnerable countries, the V20 group of 55 of the most vulnerable countries, to deepen the risk analytic capabilities that exist in these countries, right? So we can talk about risk, we can say all these very fancy things, but what does it mean in terms of the capabilities that exist in-house to translate that? In many countries, there is information. It's probably in academic institutions. What are the efforts being taken to translate that into a database that governments can work with, that the industry can work with, and importantly, we can make decisions based on. And so for us, we launched the Global Risk Modeling Alliance as the IEDF with the V20 group of countries. Industry put in resources. Many of the companies, I see them here, put in resources into this effort with the idea that we could use that to leverage public sector funding. And I'm really proud to say that today, we have been able, through the commitment from our members, we now have an announcement from the German government of $22 million to work with 10 countries to really tackle this issue of how do we deepen national capabilities and have a perspective of risk from a national perspective that also reconciles with how the market thinks about risk. And for me, to the point that David had raised earlier, that is implementation, that is tangible, that is structural in terms of its impact. The second program that we've focused on is the Global Resilience Index. Again, thinking about physical climate risk and what are some of the broad indicators that we could give in terms of where is the world going as it relates to resilience. And that was a program that we launched under the patronage of Mark Carney, Mami Muzutori, who is the head of UNDRR, as well as Eric Anderson, a sponsor, president of Aon, to really tackle this question, to be able to contribute to this dialogue at COP of what are we seeing in terms of physical resilience. And I'm happy to say that we will be sharing some first outputs of that work. And then thirdly, to I think Sawa's point and his reference to START Network was that there's engagement with the public sector, there's engagement with private sector, but there's also civil society. And how are we working with civil society through this issue of efficient and more effective humanitarian financing? And so that was also a program that we launched with the START Network, again, to help them to build capacity as it relates to the risks that they face in the 8 countries that they were interested in. But importantly, the link between that foundational information piece and what does that mean from a solutions and risk financing perspective, and what does that mean in terms of just better understanding of risk and better decision making as well, because that's also tied to resilience. So thanks.
Okay, now I want to open up that question that I mentioned earlier, which is about the principles for insurance and also private sector finance that's coming into this space. So I will open it up to Robin and Mas to share your thoughts first, and then I'll open it up to the room. So if you are working in this space and want to share your reflections or thoughts on principles for these financing instruments, please just do raise your hands, and I will come to you with the mic. So can I ask you to respond first, Robin, and then Mas?
Sure. I mean, I think EcoStray makes some excellent points. For me, what I think the insurance industry needs to be thinking about more, and you'd understand from my perspective, is to make insurance much more practical. it should also be a lot more seamless. We should look at more collaboration with insurance pretty much segueing in and fitting in neatly to any funding programs. Because quite frankly, what lenders are looking for is risk mitigation. And that's precisely what insurance is. We need a lot more of that, but we need to be more seamless so that it doesn't seem to be, you know, a burden to entrepreneurs, to persons who are investing and who are looking to maybe to borrow to fund their ventures. And we also need it to be easy. So that's particularly what we like about the program we have here. It's practical, it's fairly seamless, and it's easy. It protects the lenders as well as the borrowers. And that to me is, you know, that collaboration, that wholeness, the consideration of how it works for everyone within the system is what makes it workable. And I think this is a type of insurance program we should be looking to create more of.
So more holistic, easy to access, looking at the whole system.
The word holistic escaped me just now. Thank you for that, Karen.
We're hearing you. We're there for you. And now we're going to come to Maz, your principles for financial instruments.
Yeah, so I'll echo first what David said in his speech, that first and foremost, the private sector and the insurance industry need to listen. They need to listen to the local communities. They need to listen to their needs. They need to listen to the local organizations. You can't just sit in an office, some cubicle somewhere in an urban city and decide what's the best product that needs to be implemented in a rural area, which is most impacted by the changing climate. And obviously, disaster risk financing works best when it's curated to local needs and issues. The industry needs to follow a similar strategy, which can develop products which are customizable. They shouldn't be very, they should be flexible. They shouldn't follow a very stringent criteria or a very stringent boundary, which can, make the product very conservative to a specific area. It should be flexible. It can be, it can cater to different needs and issues. So organizations like HANDS, who have vast experience in local issues and in responding to disasters, they can work together with the private sector and through a private partnership where local voices can be heard. Grassroots organizations, other organizations, and grassroots level people, activists can come together and they can tell that what they want and how they want it. So any financial tool which needs to be developed needs to be flexible. It needs to be locally led. It needs to have local voice in it. Yeah.
Excellent and very clear. Community-led, locally based, and listening in terms of those principles. Is there anyone in the room who would like to share a reflection or some principles for consideration? Looking around.
Hi, thanks. This is a great discussion. My name is Paul Holtus. I'm the president of the World Ocean Council. So I wanted to bring in more a bit on the private sector aspects of this, which has been mentioned, but to kind of peel back that a little bit. So we bring together the various ocean and coastal industries of the world. And I really wanted to think about, have you think about how these principles could really reflect engaging the private sector in a preemptive way, really early on, as the owners of the assets, the products, the services, the operations that are affected by extreme weather events, sea level rise, etc. So I'm coming at this from a very much a coastal ocean perspective. So how can we ensure that those corporates whose assets are at risk and are those that need the insurance so much, how are they building into the insurance, the role of insurance, and linking again to the communities that are so important, because it's those companies that are providing the jobs, the fuel, the electricity, the port services, et cetera, that communities, national economies, et cetera, depend on, but really to build in that private sector role early on in shaping the future of insurance in relation to climate change.
Francis Bouchard with Marsh McLennan. I want to connect that with something that Echo Shui said as well earlier. Those private sector employers you talked about, absolutely critical to engage them, but the actual work of protecting that community needs to be done by the community level. So there needs to be that public-private partnership that Echo Shui talked about is so absolutely critical here, because the days of being able to protect your own little island or your moat around your factory and get high protected property, those days are past because we're dealing with a systemic exposure. So we need to kind of transcend, as an insurance guy, we need to transcend our traditional way of setting risk signals, which is pricing, and really understand that the community is going to be critical here to finding that solution and moving to the ex-ante space. So I think that's where, and I think David Howden was very articulate this morning, or at the beginning of this, to say we need to move into that space and use our expertise to really have an impact before the risk as opposed to after.
Well, I got the microphone. It's Rowan Douglas from WTW and the IDF. So many great points. I just want to pick up on Robin's point when he said that one of the successes of the program that Howdens have helped to enable is protecting the lender and essentially enabling high-risk borrowers to access credit to, as Ekosue said, have the confidence to take the risk. And I get the sense of whether it's in microinsurance or inclusive insurance programs around the world, or even helping sovereigns and companies access insurance, ultimately it's enabling them to get access to credit and investment, which is absolutely critical, just as we require insurance when we take out mortgages. So I think this growing relationship between investors realizing that this is a risk they need to be conscious of, and somehow integrating insurance within that system, whether it's in Jamaica or in Pakistan or even in the global north. Very exciting developments, and I think really shining a light on where we have to go. So congratulations to everybody.
Sorry, I'm mindful of the time, but luckily this year the Resilience Hub has grown in a wonderful way, so there'll be a lot of breakout space if people want to continue the conversation after this. But I actually wanted to ask a final question to our panel. Before I do that, I just want to thank everyone for contributing in the pop-up in terms of the principles, because I think it actually demonstrates that more than anything, there's a building consensus around this issue, and that the issue that, David, you brought up at the beginning of this conversation is very salient and one that people are continuing to align on and build on. And I also wanted to recognize this kind of systems change work, Ekosue, that you've been talking about. This is so important, and that enabling environment work that you're creating is going to really speed all of this. So there's a lot to pick up on and a lot to do in terms of continuing this conversation. But as a last question, this has been called the Implementation Cup. We are together for implementation, both physically and also virtually. So I wanted to ask all of our panelists, as we start to wrap this up, but also look to what comes next. What is it that you would like those in the room to really take with them and perhaps to collaborate on as we move forward together for implementation?
I would say, in some sense, radical collaboration, right? Stepping out of the comfort zone and collaborating with other parties out there that are really, challenged, and really thinking about risk. As a community, there's a lot that can be offered, right? So really thinking outside the box in terms of a willingness to engage with other parties around this, to collaborate, and just getting on with implementation. I hate to say it, but doing it instead of talking so much about it, right? Because ultimately that's what you're judged on. And happy to have further conversations with others on some of the programs that we've launched in countries with tremendous impact, I think, potential for millions of people. So.
Thank you. We need to get on with it because we will be judged on our implementation efforts, not on our intentions. Robin and Maz, I want to come to you. Maz, first to you, and then to Robin to give us your last words for the panel.
Yes, like what Ekosue said, is no more talk, it's time for implementation. We've been talking since now 27 COPs. The implementation part has been missing quite a lot, especially for the Global South. So from my closing statements, it's all about loss and damage. It's time to implement the loss and damage framework and pay the developing countries in the Global South what's due to them. So it's radical, it's critical, but unfortunately, this is the situation. We've been facing these climate disasters almost every year now, and it's not just us. It's not just the global south. These impacts will go to the global north as well very soon, and it's also impacting the heat waves and all of the different climate disasters happening there. So it's time to stop talking about it and start implementing, start acting on it.
I like that, Maz, in terms of your call on all of us to stop talking and start acting. But also, when we do talk, I want to highlight something you said, which is about loss and damage. And I think that everyone continuing to use that language together is really important as we move the conversations forward along with the actions. Robin, over to you.
Well, you know, I just really appreciate being here, being part of this panel, and even to hear some of the responses from the floor. I really like what I'm hearing. I'm going to borrow, well, let me be frank, I'm going to steal Iko Shwe's radical collaboration when I talk to persons around the Caribbean. The fact of the matter is, it's one planet, we are one world, we're closer together now than we ever have been. I think it was Ryan's point that the days of, you know, our little moats, our small secluded areas, those days are dead and gone. We are very much living in a global society. To speak to what David said this morning, we have 7 projects this year that we didn't have last year. Not their projects are actual implementations. Ours is an actual implementation. We need to multiply that significantly. We need there to be, quite frankly, thousands of these across the globe, protecting the most vulnerable, encouraging entrepreneurship, encouraging persons who are going to you know, be subsistent, to make a living from this, so we can actually increase our food security, increase our general security, and just increase the quality of life for persons across the globe. And I think insurance is has a big part to play in that.
Thank you so much, Robin. So well said. This is a global community. And I think that we can all steal, because it belongs to all of us, the radical collaboration. And so as we close, I think we've all come here. We've all come together at COP. We have a responsibility to identify additional opportunities for radical collaboration. So that's what I would leave this panel with, is that we, each of us, find those additional opportunities for radical collaboration with one another before we leave this COP27. And with that, please join me in thanking David and the 3 panelists today for sharing their insights, and thank all of you for being here.